Welcome. This is chapter 10. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the classical style and we're going to look at a brief overview of the composers of Haydn and Mozart. The classical era. So the dates of the classical era are 1750 to 1820. And one of the main elements of this era is the idea of neoclassicism. Okay, it's the emulation of, looking back at the art of ancient Greek and Rome. Okay, and artists, musicians, and so forth, they were looking at this art, and one of the things that they're taking away from the ideals of ancient Greece and Rome is the idea of symmetry and balance. Okay, so obviously, if we see these two pictures here, we see a Greek building, okay, and if we go over into the right hand side, well, this is something that was built in the classical period, and you can see, they're very similar within style, okay. Again, symmetry is going to be everything in the classical period, okay, especially with musical forms. Okay, when we want to learn about all these different forms in this classical era, we're going to learn about sonata allegro form, we're going to learn about ternary form, and these forms basically provide balance and structure to music. Okay, obviously, ornate decoration is avoided. Okay, we went from the Baroque era, which we had a lot of trills and mordents. And yes, they're used in the classical period, but they're not nearly employed as much. We also had the idea of something classical. And something classical is going to mean for us to be of the highest quality or the highest caliber. The Enlightenment. So we have this age of enlightenment. It's also called the Age of Reason. Okay, and what was going on during this time. And a lot of things are happening in the world. Okay, the world is definitely changing. We see the kind of the truth of we see the pursuit of truth and discovery of natural laws. People using the scientific method. Okay, we just definitely see all these new scientific advances between electricity. We have the steam engine. Okay, Encyclopedia Britannica. And the French Encyclopedia come out, and that was big because we now have reference books, and we have a much more interest in learning, and we have much bigger access to materials with that. Okay, so that's kind of huge. We have new ideology come out, especially with Voltaire and Rousseau, and these folks were philosophers of the age, and they were talking about social justice, equality, religious tolerance, freedom of speech. And if you guys remember, going back to the American Revolution, and a lot of those kind of philosophies are integrated with what our country was founded upon. We want freedom, we want freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And keep in mind, and these things are happening during this time. Okay. So I talked about the scientific advances. We have the growth of the middle class. Okay, the middle class is growing, and that's going to be important because people now in the middle class they have more money to spend and more free time. And when people have more free time and money, well, what do they want to do? They want to be entertained. And so we're going to see people either going to concerts, or they're going to have pianos or instruments in their home, and they're going to be performing music in their home. Okay, so that's and we're going to keep the growth of the middle class. That's going to be something that's going to be coming out and very, very important in the classical and romantic eras. And then we have the age of the revolution. Now, obviously, we have the American Revolution first, in 1776. We have the Declaration of Independence, and we're kicking out the British. That was huge. Okay, here's this, these colonies that have no power, and they go up against probably the most prominent army of the time, and they win. That was big. So we have the American Revolution, and then we start to see, in 1789, we have the French Revolution and storming the Bastille. So these kind of things are going on during the classical period. And these are the things that also influence, they'll influence music, especially when we get to Beethoven. They'll influence philosophy and art as well. Public concerts. So one of the things that really starts to come out in the classical period and is definitely in full force by the end of the classical period, is the idea of public concerts, people selling subscription series, and concertizing. Okay, so performances gradually moved from the private courts to the concert hall. Definitely in the classical period, which we'll talk about, a lot of the musicians like Haydn and kind of Mozart, Haydn definitely, they're writing for aristocrats still. They're on, with Haydn, he's working and working for a family called the Esterhazy family. And a lot of his music was performed in private halls, private courts, and it wasn't accessible to the public. Towards like the 1780s, 1790s, things start to change, where composers now are either they're freelance composers or they're putting public concerts on. Okay, you'll start to see artists being performing artists going from town to town to town, performing in public concert halls. And we also see each town is going to build their own concert hall and their own opera hall. Okay, and these concert halls, basically they're charging tickets, they're charging ticket sales, and they're making a profit on this. Okay, so we see public concerts start to come out during the classical period. Okay, public opera. Now, opera was huge in the Baroque era, and it's just going to be just as huge and just as important in the classical period. Okay, but we're going to have a few changes. We're going to have opera being performed at public houses, okay? And we're going to have a shift from serious opera to comic opera, okay? And in the Baroque era, you're going to have a lot of pieces where Greek tragedies, very serious stuff. Everyone's dying at the end, or so forth. In the classical period, we start to see a new genre called opera buffa. Okay, it's basically comic opera. And this opera, this comic opera, it's geared towards the middle class. We'd see satires of pompous, incompetent aristocrats, and this opera would be kind of poking fun at the higher ups, the echelons or the aristocrats. Okay, and it does two things. It serves as kind of comic relief, and for people like Mozart, it's a way for him to have commentary on some of the main issues that were going on during his time. Again, because remember, Mozart didn't have freedom of speech, but he was able to make, through comedy, he was able to make a couple, political statements through opera, which he does. So we'll see, spoken dialogue. We'll see simpler songs. There's very simple, very kind of everyday tunes or catchy tunes. Use of everyday characters, in situations, a lot, gags or bawdy humor, okay, and a lot of some opera, it reflects a social change as well that kind of inspires it. So we have here an example from Don Giovanni. Let's take a listen. Yeah, and that's an example from Don Giovanni, which is an opera by Mozart, which we'll delve into deeper. The advent of the piano. Now, one of the main staples that comes out of the classical period is the piano. Definitely is invented, but it's improved upon, okay, and it starts to be mass produced. So by the end of the classical period, we're going to see the piano in a lot of the middle class homes. Okay, it was invented around 1700. Okay, and again, it wasn't great at the time. It takes several generations to really, really get for the piano to kind of get to where it is today. Okay, but it's a very, very important instrument because of a couple of things. If you remember, it can play loud music, it can play soft music, and also we have a damper pedal, so we can actually play chords in the hole while we play melodies. So it makes a great instrument for playing at homes. Okay, it replaces the harpsichord. As I say, it plays more than one dynamic level. It was originally nicknamed the pianoforte, and on a side note, in Italian, piano means soft, forte means loud, so the name basically was the soft loud. Obviously, over time, pianoforte, the forte gets dropped. We just call it the piano today. So again, a big thing of the classical period was amateur music making. Okay, many amateur pianists were women. Okay, and people would started writing in the classical period. They're writing a lot of piano sonatas. They're writing a lot, songs, and a lot of maybe a cello sonatas or violin sonatas or chamber music that's going to be geared for playing in the homes. Okay, as I said, we have this growing middle class now, and people have more time and more money, and so now we're going to have concerts at home. Keep in mind, you can't just go turn on YouTube back in the day. There's no TVs or radios. So if you wanted to listen to music, well, you're going to have to do one or two things: go to a concert or make it your own. So we have an example of some piano music here, and it's Mozart's variation on Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. So let's go listen to the piano. Elements of the classical style. One of the main elements of the classical style is melody, but also the treatment of melody. Um, so a lot of the melodies in the classical period are very tuneful, lyrical, or singable melodies. Okay, and as I said previously, symmetry is very, very important in this classical period. So we're going to see well balanced phrases, usually in what we call an antecedent and consequent phrase. The antecedent phrase kind of asks a musical question, and then the consequent phrase will be the answer to that musical question. Okay. We have an example of the middle movement to Mozart's Piano Concerto, or that slow movement, and it's a great lyrical melody. Let's go take a listen. Another element of the classical style is harmony. And a lot of the harmonies in the classical period are going to be tonal harmonies or diatonic harmonies. They're going to be centered around a specific key area. And the harmonic rhythm is much more fluid and flexible than, of course, the Baroque period. So, as far as another thing we'll look at is, with texture, the classical period is definitely very, very homophonic, whereas the Baroque period was more polyphonic. So another thing we want to look at is the use of what we call Alberti bass. And basically, an Alberti bass is chords that are arpeggiated before a steady stream of sound. With the piano pieces, we'll see an Alberti bass played in the left hand lots of times, while the right hand plays a melody. In this example, we have a Mozart piano sonata. So the melody is going to be played in the right hand, and this Alberti bass is played in the left hand. Let's take a listen. Another element that we want to talk about is the classical style is rhythm, texture, and then dynamics. So rhythm, obviously, basically it remains the same as the Baroque period. We do see a lot of more rhythmic flexibility and greater variety within a single movement. Okay, So let's go listen to our rhythmic example. Next, we have texture, okay? And texture is a big change. A lot of the later Baroque music is polyphonic, okay? In the classical period, most of our texture is going to be homophonic. It's going to have a melody and harmony. We will see counterpoint used, but it's not nearly used as much as it was in the Baroque era. Let's go listen to our texture example. Okay. And then finally, we have dynamics. Dynamics definitely are used a lot in the classical period. We have a lot of crescendos and then diminuendos. Crescendos are going to be kind of starting softly and gradually getting louder. Okay. Diminuendo is the opposite, where we would maybe start loudly and then kind of just back away. Okay. Rapid changes in music, texture, color, dynamic, kind of gives us a new sense of urgency, a new sense of drama. Okay. Let's go listen to our example for dynamics. And as you can see, it's a Mozart symphony. The very loudness, and you back away, and you have this like soft kind of textures to this piece. Really adds a new dynamic to the piece. So they are very effective. Now that we talked about elements of music, I want to talk about several other composers that are important to the classical period. And before we do that, we have to look at where they're operating at. And so we have Vienna. Okay, Vienna is home to the classical composers. And if you look over here at this map, this is a map of kind of what Europe looked like during the classical period. France is still there, England's there, Spain's there. We don't have, we have Switzerland's pretty much there. Vienna is part of the Austrian Empire at the time, and it's a part of what we call Austria today. Okay, it's the capital of Austria. So we have this thing called the Viennese School. Okay, and the composers that are associated with the Viennese School are going to be Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. Okay. Those four are they basically kind of the umbrella composers to what we call the Viennese classical style. Now, there's a couple things I want to be clear about. First off, when I say Viennese school, it wasn't that Haydn, Beethoven, Mozart are going to the same school, okay, or they don't have a physical building like like Rutgers University or so forth. When we use school in this kind of term. It's basically they're working and operating with the same methodology or the same ideology. Okay, they're writing in similar styles. They're using and they're influencing each other. Okay. Now, keep in mind, Vienna is the cultural crossroads or the cultural center to Europe. Okay, if you wanted to make it as a composer or make it as a musician during this period, you went to Vienna. Okay, just like if you want to be, if you want to be a big movie star, if you want to be the next Brad Pitt, where do you go? You go to Hollywood here. If you want to be like an artist or a photographer, you might go to New York City. Back in the day, if you wanted to be a famous pianist, famous composer, you went to Vienna to make it. Okay, so Vienna had a lot of cultural crossroads for all of Europe. Okay, it was the capital at one point for the old Holy Roman Empire. It's of course the largest city in Europe, probably next to London and Paris. They probably were the largest at the time. Again, it's a huge cosmopolitan center, so obviously it's going to be attracting musicians from all around Europe. Okay, it's going to have aristocratic patrons as well. Okay, you're going to have aristocrats coming from Russia, Poland, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy. Everyone's going to come to Vienna to either hear, Beethoven play, to hear new Mozart operas, to hear Haydn symphonies, so forth. Again, in this city, we're definitely going to have a lot of those public concerts. And we're also going to have a thriving community of amateur performers as well. Franz Joseph Haydn. So one of the most important composers of the classical era is Haydn. His dates are 1732 to 1809. He was one of the first great composers to move to Vienna. He served as a choir boy. He studied composition, violin, and keyboard at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. And he also worked as a freelance musician until later on he got employed by the Esterhazy family. Now I have an example of a string quartet by Haydn. Let's go listen. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So another of the main composers that we're going to look at in the classical period is Mozart. His dates are 1756 to 1791. And if you look at those dates, you do the math, he only lived to be 35 years old. He made a very, very important impact on the classical period, but was only 35 when he died. Okay, that says something. So he's born in Salzburg, Austria. Salzburg's a town way outside of Vienna. It's kind of, it's definitely pretty kind of far away. He was born into a musical family, okay? And his father was a musician. His sister was a musician. And he was probably one of the most famous prodigies that we're going to have, throughout music, okay? A prodigy is basically someone who early on understands and can perform the piano and write music and so forth at a very, very high level very, very early on. And Mozart could do that. He played the piano at 3 years old and 4 years old. He was very, very skilled, okay? And his father realized this, and what does he do? Well, he pushes Mozart to really, really study. He studied the violin, studied the piano, study whatever he could, and then he takes Mozart and his sister on tour, and they tour for years throughout Northern Europe and Italy, okay? And they play for kings, queens, they play for everybody. This was a novelty to have this child who's 4 or 5 years old get up, play the piano like nobody's business, and then put that down, go to the violin, and play the violin. And he definitely got a lot of accolades in touring through Europe as a young kid. Okay. In addition, not only was he touring through Europe, playing through all these dukes and kings and queens, he was getting exposed to a wealth of music styles. He would the music styles in Germany. When he went to opera to Italy, he would get exposed to all this Italian opera. When he performed for the Pope in the Vatican, he'd hear all the sacred music. So again, touring throughout Europe was very, very impactful in Mozart's education, as a composer. So towards the 1770s, he becomes a court musician in Salzburg. He's working for the church at the time. He's not happy with it. He's not thrilled. He doesn't want to be told what to do. And so later on, he'll eventually move to Vienna. Now, I have an example here, an example which I'm sure you guys have heard before, but we're going to play it again. Probably one of his most famous pieces is called Eine kleine Nachtmusik, or the English translation is A Little Night Music. Let's listen. Mozart in Vienna. So as I said in the last slide, Mozart was working for the Archduke of Salzburg, and he wasn't happy doing it. He didn't want to be told what to do. He didn't want to be told what to write. He wanted to be, a freelance musician. And so what does he do? He picks up from Salzburg and moves to Vienna. As I said, remember earlier, if you wanted to make it as a musician, you got to go to Vienna. So, he's working as a freelance musician from about 1781 to 1791, okay? And how did he make his money? Well, he accepted commissions, and a commission basically is, I'm going to pay you to write me a piece of music. He performed at a lot of public concerts. He actually wrote many of his piano concertos were intended for public concerts, and he played the part as a soloist. And of course, he taught. He taught music composition to many students. So at the peak of success, 1784 to about 1787, he was organizing a lot of concerts. He was composing, he was teaching. Towards the later on, he was plagued with ill health, and some financial difficulties. A lot of people always said, Mozart, he died as a pauper and he was dead broke, and that's not necessarily true. Mozart did have a lot of money coming in, but the problem with Mozart was he wasn't very good at saving his money. He was, he liked to party and liked to, he liked to spend. And he wasn't very good with his money. Okay, so he did have financial difficulties. With that aside, though, his reputation. Now, remember, Haydn lived, well into his late 70s, early 80s. Mozart was 35 years old, and he's extremely influential even today. His compositions, display a lot of diversity, breadth of expression. He was definitely a musical genius, and he composed in many genres. He wrote 41 great symphonies. The 40th and the 41st symphonies are really awesome symphonies. He wrote like 12 to 13 operas. And 3 of his operas, Don Giovanni, The Marriage of Figaro, and Così fan tutte, they kind of set the standard for what classical opera is about. He wrote a myriad of piano pieces and string quartets. And I'm not listing everything, but again, he made his impact on classical music, and he was very influential. He was influential in composers of the era and composers to come, so forth. So this concludes chapter 10. So in this chapter, we talked about kind of an overview of the classical period, the advent of the piano. We looked at 2 of the 3 main composers of the classical period. We looked at the music of Haydn. We looked at the music of Mozart. So let's continue on to chapter 11, and I look forward to seeing you there.